Even though it happened 30 years ago, people on the South Shore and in southeastern Massachusetts remember the blizzard of 1978 as if it were yesterday. They'd never experienced anything like it. It was called the Storm of the Century. The Patriot Ledger and the Enterprise asked some local residents, from fire chiefs to commuters caught in its fury, what stories they still tell about the storm that began on February 6, 1978 and just wouldn't quit.
It was a horror show. It's the worst thing that I have ever seen, and I hope to never see anything like it again. The ocean and the wind and the snow was unbelievable. The first time in my life, and I even was out in the 38 hurricane. I was only a young fellow. That was the first time I was sitting on the town pier in my car, and the first time in my life that I ever looked out at the water and said, if I seen somebody out there, I could not go out and rescue him. It was so mean. You know, that's a hard thing to think about and say, but it was the God's honest truth. You know, it was just like a fireman that couldn't go in a house to rescue people with the flames and all that. Wind was blowing about 115 out on First Cliff. That's miles per hour. It was snowing, and the waves in the harbor at the town pier was about 7 to 8 feet. It was just unbelievable. Never seen anything that bad in my life, and I hope I don't see it again.
The children and I spent the night in the attic with a bucket brigade, trying to keep the water that was coming through the front of the house and the roof from ruining the ceilings upstairs. Along the seawall on C Street at the Willows, houses were lifted right off of their foundations. Firemen were manning rowboats in order to rescue the people. My brother-in-law, whose house lifted off, had to jump on his refrigerator as it floated around the kitchen, waiting for the firemen to come and rescue him.
I decided to take a little ride around the city just to see what things look like. And I'll tell you, it was really scary to see the areas that a plow hadn't even got into. And my first thought was, if we ever had a fire, I don't know how we would ever get to these houses. And we were very fortunate throughout the blizzard that we never had a major incident.
The blizzard of 78 was the biggest winter storm in modern history. It was the storm with the biggest impact in the area south of Boston and especially along the coast since the blizzard of 1888. In some ways, you would only see an event like this once in 500 years.
It was an incredible week. Frankly, it was kind of nice to rule by decree because the legislature couldn't get into the State House. So it was just me, you know, and that was kind of fun. And the incredible outpouring of help and support, it was remarkable. It was the leadership of my Secretary of Public Safety that really made the difference. Charlie Barry. The one thing I did, which was helpful, was to put the National Guard under Barry. And so they were deployed all over the place, along with the fire and police and all that kind of stuff.
We left for work that morning. They were saying snow flurries. The storm was going to pass south of us. Despite the revisionism that we saw during the 25th anniversary, they didn't forecast the blizzard.
The woman across the street from me, Kay Gunning, she had a small little house, and the water, the marsh erupted and it was coming up over the street. And the man next door, Frank McPatlin, and my husband went over, and Frank carried her out on his back because she didn't want to come. She didn't realize that the flood was coming. It was very sad because she kept watching the water come up, you know, and it was going in her windows. And she said, you know, all my memories are gone now. You know, other houses were off their foundations, were in the middle of the road, were in the ocean, stones piled high on the road, and just a horror scene. A child and a man died in the boat as they were trying to escape. I guess the boat got swamped by a wave coming in, even though they were on the street.
When the ocean water came in, it lifted up and broke up the ice. Now the ice floated out onto Hatherley Road and did damage to houses across the street.
I worked for Channel 5 at the time as a freelance person in court. And I can remember that the people who were there had to stay there. And people who usually would do features or working behind the scenes were on the air. because they had to keep it going all the time, but a lot of their staff couldn't get in. People were forbidden to really leave town or to go to work. They certainly were forbidden by the state to go through Boston.
The winds were gusting to hurricane force by 10, 11, 8 p.m. And of course the tides came in at several times in the next day or two with very high surf and washed a lot of houses off their foundations. And then of course all of the traffic that was stopped on 128 got snowbound and were never able to move, and they had to end up towing those cars out. It took a week to get the cars off of 128.
The Army came in with bulldozers. The Army bulldozers, there was a house right in the middle of the road, and they were going to just crush it. And everybody kept saying, no, just push it over here. And so they did. They pushed it over onto somebody else's piece of land, and that got it out of the street. But of course it did a lot of damage. Pushing a house around, you don't do those kind of things.
And when the transformer was hit, we called, because at the time I had a small child, an infant, and they told me that because there were only 3 houses involved at the time, they didn't know when they'd be able to get to my lights, and because of the baby, they sent this extremely large Army truck up for me and the 4 children, drove us down to the school, sent out for a crib for the baby. A lot of people who stayed with me were from Route 24 because all their cars were stuck. The kids played in the gym. They had a good time. The adults, not so much.
The pet shop down near the supermarket, it was BPM then, it's Shaw's now. Roof collapsed on that, and people were so panicky that they were actually going in and looting the place, getting pet food for their pets.
Not only was it snowing very heavily, of course, but there was also a good amount of lightning. So you'd have these flashes of light at the same time as snowing with visibility pretty much down to zero.
For the first time in my life, I drove a snowmobile from West Bridgewater to Brockton, actually going up and down the streets. It was really unique. Actually, when we get out and looked around, you could see how bad this thing really was. The city at that point was pretty paralyzed. There was virtually nothing moving. Cars were stuck in the middle of the streets. I actually went into work with the snowmobile. I had a trailer so that we could carry things on the trailer. A couple other firefighters that had snowmobiles also came to Station 1.
As I was driving along in front of Archbishop Williams, I couldn't even see. I had the car window open and my head out so that I could see. I was praying frantically. But when I got to Route 18, the Weymouth exit, nobody was getting up the hill, but there was a group of teenagers that were pushing everyone up, and they were saving the day. They were like angels.
Second day of the blizzard, I lived over on Black Rock Beach, and some friends of mine and us, we collected the little lobsters off the beach. We probably had about 100 of them, and we cooked them in a pot on the street. This guy came by and said, well, you can't have an open fire in the street like that. And we said, well, why not? And he said, well, I guess you can. We cooked the lobsters, and we had a grand old time for ourselves.
My husband and I woke up in the morning to see if he had to go to work. We looked out, and there was too much snow, so we went back to bed, and all of a sudden, swish, all over the bed, the baby broke the water. He got up, called up the police department, fire department. My husband handed the shovel out of the door to him, and my neighbors came out and helped shovel, and then they took us to the hospital. We had to wait a little while because there was 9 babies born that day, and he was born in the afternoon.
The children thought it was great fun. Everybody was out in the neighborhood. Nobody could use a car, so everybody was out either shoveling or talking to neighbors. It was a very community-like time.
It was a terrible tragedy of the storm overall. Now you think back, this is 30 years ago, but in 1978 dollars, it was $1 billion storm cost. And more importantly, there were 54 lives lost.
You never forget what happened, because every time you go down to the seashore and see how calm it is and how beautiful it is.
This is Sue Scheibel reporting for the Patriot Ledger and the Enterprise. For more coverage, see today's newspapers or go to patriotledger.com.